So we're now at time. Scott, with your permission, I think I will get us started. Hello, everyone. My name is Hallie Perlick, and I am the technical manager for this session on food policy and politics, chaired by Scott Drimmie. Thank you for taking part in ANH 2021, and we look forward to a robust and interactive session with you all today. A quick reminder that everything you might need to access our conference materials and program can be found on our website at anh-academy.org/ANH2021. Before Scott moves us forward with this conversation, I just have a few small technical announcements to ensure our experience is as smooth as possible. So first, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. All participants have been muted, but please use the chat box to introduce yourselves. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization that you work with. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed throughout this session, but if your connection is bad, then we recommend turning your video off. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation with a Q&A. If you have questions, we invite you to please share them in the chat box throughout the session, and we will raise them during the Q&A. Last, if at any point you experience technical issues, please first check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link you used to be here today. If you have a technical question, please send me a direct message in the chat box. Thanks, and I will pass it over to you, Scott.
Hallie, thanks very much. And yes, welcome everyone. It's a very exciting session that we have ahead of us. Food policy and politics, in many ways, the essence of what it is to bring together these domains of agriculture, nutrition, and health. And we have four wonderful speakers with four superb papers that will really explore the intricacies of the politics of food and engaging with it in ways that we can ultimately transition a system that is struggling in so many parts of the world into something that is more equitable, sustainable, a question I think that we will really engage with. So we have with us Jody Harris from the World Vegetable Center, Busisa Moyo, who's currently with the University of the Western Cape, Diana Leahy from the Faculty of Education at Monash University, and Alejandro Jorin from the International Institute for Environment and Development. And the range of issues are in many ways around sectoral policy, how we bring sectors together to ultimately create this good around nutrition, the case study in Vietnam. We look in a very rigorous way at the right to food, drawing out things such as sovereignty, security, and justice. We look at transformation in terms of the environment and society, but focusing very clearly on school food education. So thinking about intergenerational change and laying the basis for a future system. And then looking at 3 East African countries in terms of informal dairy markets and looking at commonalities and differences and really drawing out some of the sort of the intricacies of how states are struggling with formality and informality with questions of food safety and ultimately nutrition. So certainly a very, very interesting panel that we have in front of us. So the way we're going to work is after this very brief introduction, each speaker will be given the opportunity to speak for 8 minutes. We will run through each of them, so in sequence, all 4 of them, and then we'll open it up for discussion. As the process unfolds, you have the opportunity to place questions in the Q&A, the comment, and we will harvest those and then place them before the panelists so they are able to respond to that. And if there are issues that you'd like to also speak to, we do have the opportunity if you would like to speak into the discussion as well. After 40 minutes or so, I will then pull the discussion to a close. I will try and distill some of the key themes and issues. And then right at the end, we'll have a review of how it's gone in terms of a very rapid poll. So that is the way the session will work, and that is the way the timing will in fact work. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to ask Jody Harris from the World Vegetable Center to speak to us on trade policy and nutrition in Vietnam. Many co-authors with her, and certainly something that I think would be of great interest. Thanks very much, Jodie.
Thank you, Scott. Do you see my presentation or my notes?
We see your presentation very well.
That's great. Thank you for the introduction. And good evening, everyone from Bangkok. So I'm presenting our work today on trade agreements and the policy space for nutrition in Vietnam. And this is work, although I'm at the World Vegetable Center now, that I did at the Institute of Development Studies. And I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors. Tu Yen, who was supposed to be presenting, couldn't make it today. So apologies for those of you who were hoping to hear her, but you have me. I'm hoping some of my colleagues are online as well, so we'll be able to answer any questions together in the discussion. So from a nutrition perspective, trade is important in moving nutrients from where they're produced to where they can be consumed. And obviously some of that's going to be across national borders, so international trade. And this figure, which is blurrier than I thought, shows the change in the number of people who could potentially access different nutrients if current trade flows were removed. So for many micronutrients in particular, trade is important in their supply. So global trade has shaped food systems over centuries to get to that situation, but modern trade agreements and globalization are hastening these changes and making them more complex. So at their most basic, these agreements are bilateral or multilateral country treaties to facilitate trade between the signatories. So they influence what foods are traded and where, and they shape which foods or nutrients are available in domestic markets, as we just saw, and also at what price. But modern trade agreements, and you can see some of the complexities in this slide, go further than that in shaping different spheres of policy in signatory countries. And they might additionally affect the space that national governments have to create or enforce policy that protects other public welfare outcomes, things like health and nutrition. So this study aimed to understand the impact of the 2018 Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, a brand name, we call it the CPTPP. And we're looking at the impacts of that trade deal on the policy space for public health nutrition in Vietnam, which is a country obviously going through social, economic, and nutrition transitions at the moment. So this study was framed around the theory of policy space. So we call that the agency and available tools and mechanisms that policy actors have in creating or reforming or implementing policy towards their own beliefs or interests. So first, we conducted a comparative document review of the CPTPP document itself and national policy documents in light of global guidelines. Then we conducted key informant interviews with actors across trade and agriculture and nutrition, and across different organization types. And then we used descriptive and analytical coding to draw out respondent understandings of the drivers of both trade and nutrition issues and policy responsibility for those. And then analysis of both of those data streams, the documents and the interviews, was through the political science theory of advocacy coalitions to theoretically explain those emerging empirical findings. So obviously there's more detail in the paper on those methods, but the methods are replicable in any country, either joining the CPTPP or joining other free trade deals, to understand how a new policy is likely to affect existing public welfare policy. So first we analysed each of the 30 sections of this CPTPP trade policy to identify text that was potentially of concern with relation to public health nutrition policy space. And then we cross-referenced that with 50 national policies in the areas of nutrition and health, food and economic development that would have relevance to public health nutrition. And so any tensions found between those two things, the policy documents and the trade document, were classified according to 6 areas specified by the WHO non-communicable disease prevention guidelines at the top of the slide there. So a majority of policy interactions between the policies and the trade deal were in the sections of the CPTPP relating to technical barriers to trade. So 21% of the tensions in policies reviewed related to these things called technical barriers to trade. And they refer to a whole range of different non-tariff measures, non-tax measures that countries can use to regulate markets, to protect their consumers, or to protect domestic industries. So things like requiring food labeling or restricting advertising can be seen as technical barriers to trade, and countries can be sued then under the terms of the trade deal if companies or countries feel that it's damaging their sales. And then another large set of tensions that we found were around government procurement, which had tensions with around 11% of policies. And that relates to government purchases of food, institutional purchases of food for places like schools and hospitals. So in this deal, procurement can't be limited to local or national companies, but would have to be open to other countries in the deal. And so when categorized according to these WHO guidelines, most tensions related to protecting policymaking from vested interests, so around 20% of the tensions, 24% actually, and specific policy options to increase healthy food options, so around 15% of the tensions related to that. So turning from the policy review to the interviews, different groups of policy actors obviously hold different beliefs and interests on those issues. And so from those, they promote different framings or different narratives and therefore different policy approaches to the issues. So we identified, perhaps unsurprisingly, 2 advocacy coalitions came out very clearly in the interviews. So there was a trade coalition holding that the policy position that free trade improves nutrition by default. And so their interests are in expanding markets for agricultural produce, for promoting economic growth and promoting business. And then a nutrition coalition holding the policy position that nutrition should be explicitly considered in trade policy. But it was interesting that this group didn't have a very clear understanding or policy position on the issue of trade or how it might affect nutrition or what should be done. So the trade and nutrition coalitions were very separate in their interests and actions. They were very unequal in their resources and capacity as well. And public health actors were generally less informed and with fewer resources. So in our interpretation of policy space then, the space for social welfare objectives like nutrition is expanded and constrained through support and opposition by these different actors. And in Vietnam, the broader context is one of stronger alignment to global trade, but with political commitment to aspects of health in policy and government funding. So there is opportunity to raise the issue of tensions between trade and nutrition policy, but those issues haven't been considered together so far.
Okay, Jodie, sorry, I beg your pardon. You have about a minute left.
Thank you very much. So one area on which both coalitions agreed was the need for evidence-based policy as far as possible. So it's been demonstrated that a nutrition transition is happening in Vietnam in a previous paper and others, and that this is driven by changes in food systems and underpinned by that broader social and economic drivers. So our analysis here adds evidence that trade agreements affect the policy space for protecting or improving nutrition through food, but also through those broader policy processes like protecting or constraining public welfare policy. And that's in line with other studies in India and South Africa. It's also of global relevance. So a study even today found similar issues for UK trade agreements. And this is important because where policy isn't legally enforceable, global trade deals are, and so they're very likely to win in these sort of global policy debates and in national policy processes if tested. So we conclude from our analysis that the policy space for nutrition in Vietnam has important potential constraints, and that the trade and nutrition coalitions need to interact more regularly, more constructively in order to foresee those tensions and create plans for their mitigation. So thank you to the Stories of Change project for supporting this work, and obviously to the research participants for giving their time. And I very much look forward to our discussions. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much, Jody, and thank you for bringing critical analysis into very clear implications for future policy making, so placing it in a very practical way in the end. Our next speaker, Busiso Moyo, with a paper titled Fulfilling the Right to Food for South Africa, Justice, Security, Sovereignty, and the Politics of Malnutrition. Busiso, you have 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just trying to share my screen real quick. Okay, we're good to go. Everybody sees my screen?
It looks good.
All right, thank you very much. Hi everyone, greetings, and thank you for the opportunity for me to present this research of ours that was co-authored together with my supervisor, Dr. Anne-Marie Tho, who is based at the University of Sydney, all the way in Australia. I'm coming live from Johannesburg, but I am a doctoral candidate, registered with the School of Public Health at the University of the Western Cape, all the way in Cape Town. And in essence, my presentation today just has to do with policy paradigms that inform the real politicking space in South Africa insofar as the attainment of the right to food goes. In essence, this is a discussion about, the limits of orthodox human rights discourses, but also it touches on, the possibilities of justice insofar as, the injustice that we experience in the food system goes. And my problem statement as a point of departure speaks to this, to say, look, there are these 3 global rights-based master frames or paradigms that have informed most of food policy making leading up to this moment in time, and namely we're speaking of food justice, food security, and food sovereignty. And I do not even do justice insofar as how I've briefly described these concepts there, but I think they have major relevance in South Africa, where we have this constitutional heritage that informs most of our interventions insofar as some of our efforts go, insofar as bringing about a nourishing food system for all. So constitutionally speaking, in South Africa, we have codified the right to food in our constitution, and part of that then speaks to these different lenses and paradigms and frames that have to do with how then we understand that right to food discourse, insofar as speaking to the fact of what is the content of the right to food, what is the role of the state as a principal duty bearer, and so forth and so forth. And the reality is that what we're faced with in South Africa, the last sort of like nationwide consensus or broad sort of survey that we did speaking to the attainment of a nourishing food system pretty much gave us, what I've detailed here on my slides, insofar as giving you guys the sort of face and a situational analysis of what it is that we are faced with as a country. And part of the problem then linked to the situational analysis that South Africa is faced with is that we've got this econometric thinking that seems to be at the forefront of all engagements with policy practitioners and with the state. And part of what I'm getting at here is that, I'm speaking of a desire or the need for a well-being economy insofar as talking about this appetite that I have for a nourishing food system. But unfortunately, this econometric thinking often sidelines other discourses that could, that need to be centered within the policy cycle and within the agenda setting that could speak to a more nourishing and more credible food system. But generally speaking, from a global sort of lens, linking that to the local advocacy challenges that I'm speaking about, is that what we are now faced with, generally speaking, insofar as the scholarship that seeks to grapple with activism, with this human rights discourse, with the right to food and nutrition, is that it's anchored between this dichotomy that has to do with capital interests and food movements that are driven by this militancy from below, and those that are currently I can say, in control of the agenda setting. So at face value, that's what we have there. That is my attempt at trying to locate those different paradigms and their origins and their genealogy and where it is that we find ourselves in 2021. So the paper that we've written is very lengthy. It's quite preachy, but in an attempt not to dwell too much on the theoretical underpinnings, because it is a theoretical contribution, we then delve into what then these paradigms mean for a country like South Africa. And I speak, as an activist scholar who's also grappling with, how to then embrace these global paradigms and their relevance for what it is that we're going through here as a country. So the overarching argument of the paper is pretty much that, food security, although it is part of, a hegemonic human rights discourse, is currently being rejected by justice movements because, it is trapped within this force field of imperial relations of food, so to speak. And part of the origin of this talk is anchored in the American struggle that also references race struggles, class struggles, and how those then, affect the populace at large and their interface with the food system. And with that said, I guess this then leads us to some of my frustrations with the food security narrative as the dominant one that is sought to unpack some of these contestations for us, because I am of the opinion, at least this is what the paper seeks to amplify, which is that food security has become of diminishing value, to justice projects and to the food justice movement. And the fact that now we have the emergence of movements like La Via Campesina, then that speaks to this fact that it's become something that is co-opted as part of this hegemonic human rights discourse. However, that still seems to not satisfy some of our dissatisfactions as activists, so to speak. And drawing in and then zoning in closer then to this idea of food security, because the paper then speaks about the genealogy of this master frame and how it is that it is sought to unpack the problem ultimately being the fact that why is it that the food system is still failing to deliver? Why is it that in South Africa, we are still failing to fulfill the rights to food? And ultimately what we then see is that this is why we have this emergency of the militancy that comes with a food movement like La Via Campesina, like food sovereignty, insofar as saying, food sovereignty then can be said to reject this dominant tendency towards the securitization of issues. And by securitization here, I am referring to, the increasing use of security language by states and institutions and individuals to garner support and some sort of like international solidarity. But beyond that, I think as well, food security forms part of this development discourse that seeks to secure, uninsured populations, surplus populations, as one would like to refer to. But I see that I'm almost out of time. And I'm going to dash through because it's really a preachy paper and I had a lot that I wanted to drive home. But ultimately what I'm getting at here is that, what is the content of the right to food? And what we're seeing here is that food sovereignty has a lot of possibilities yet unexplored that could give us a better insight and a better lens with which to grapple with some of the developments and some of the bottlenecks that we're currently faced with, and so far as bringing about that nourishing food system. And to just dash through that, in South Africa, we have a problem of inequality. So ultimately what we're getting at here is how do we address food inequality? How do we ensure that the system caters to all in a way that leaves nobody behind? In the words of Raj Patel, just to wrap it up there, food sovereignty therefore consistently means this right to act, this militancy to be guarded, to try then and respond to all these frustrations that we're faced with. But then again, just to conclude, and this is something that I also raised in the lab that I was involved in last week, which is ultimately to say, look, when we're talking food systems, we're talking about complexity here. We are talking about, that journey from farm to fork. I, for one, I'm coming through and I want to address the politics of malnutrition, taking on this public health lens. Perhaps, could it be that we need to then zone or have a shift away from this right to food obsession we have and start speaking about the need for a standalone right to nutrition in light of the complexity that describes and speaks to some of the challenges we're looking to address. Yes, with that said, I hope I did this justice in 8 minutes. I started rambling on there at the end. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Pusiso. So the possibilities of sovereignty and moving the language from the right to food to the right to nutrition. And I think you've opened up some very interesting questions for all of us. So thank you very much. So our third speaker, Diana Leahy, will talk to us around also transformation, but in this instance, the issue of transforming food systems by looking at school food education in the Pacific. Diana, you have 8 minutes. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and greetings from Melbourne. This is the latest I've been up for a long time, so I'll do my best. Thanks to the previous presenters, and as I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think what food education both of those papers would make. Today I'm presenting my paper, Transforming Food Systems, Transforming School Food Education. And the research that I'm drawing from, it was funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, and they funded me to do a small scoping review. And so I'll be presenting some very brief early findings from that review. Needless to say that COVID really did get in the way of me completing this research, but I'm sure there are many of you in that the same situation. Once I've talked a little bit about the problem in the Pacific context, I'm going to share with you an example of what transformative school food education could look like. And it's an example that engages kids with learning about local food environments and engaging them in processes of taking action to bring about change to their local food environments. So basically the problem, and none of this will be new to any of you, is that we currently find ourselves facing a global syndemic, so a triplex of crises related to obesity, malnutrition and climate change. And so it's unsurprising then that food is considered to be the greatest lever that we have to achieve both personal and planetary health. In that context, the call to radically transform the food system has been amplified and intensified. And so we need to tend to those transformations rather urgently, given the crises that we're facing. Given that we need to transform the food system, I want to suggest that we actually need to think about education as a key platform right across the food system, and that we need to be thinking about transforming school food education. But I also would add we need to be thinking about how we might transform how we do public education about the food system. But today my conversation is really based around thinking about school food education. One of the issues, though, of current versions of school food education, that it's often done under the guise of nutrition education. So it's often hyper-individualised, and it tends to responsibilise individuals to make behaviour change or lifestyle changes so that they consume a healthy diet. And in its current form, I want to suggest that it's actually not going to make a significant contribution to the great food transformation that needs to occur. I'm not saying that nutrition education isn't important, but I am saying that it's limited, and we need to think more capaciously about versions of food education moving forward. Looking more closely at the Pacific context, and some of the things that I've talked about already are pertinent to the Pacific context. As part of our scoping review, we conducted a literature review, a policy analysis, and a curriculum review. We had wanted to engage with the key policy actors in the Pacific, but that was one of the issues around COVID and its impact on our research, and that's scheduled for another phase of the research. The Pacific region is dealing with significant rates of NCDs and the various and quite severe impacts of climate change. And as a result, you do see that food is targeted by a range of policies across the regional policy scape and within individual countries. And you see food targeted by education policies, health policies, and agriculture. But when we actually get down to look at food education and school food education in particular, we tend to see the dominance of nutrition education. So similar to my conversation before, when we start talking about school food education, it often defaults back to talking about nutrition education and an individual behaviours lifestyle focus. So if we just simply educate young people to eat properly, whatever that might mean, then that they should actually be able to go and eat properly. And there's a lack of recognition there about, in particular in the Pacific, the food environments and how food environments actually impact on food consumption and food practices. When we look at the research that's been conducted in the Pacific around school food education, and Sarah Burkhart's work has been an absolute standout here in the work that she's done in the Pacific, the majority of the research tends to focus on the problem of implementation. And we can get caught in a trap of thinking about, oh, if only schools would, for example, implement the programs that you've developed or we've developed for them. And they're important insights, but very rarely do we actually look at the models that are being advocated. So what I want to suggest is, moving forward, if we're going to transform school food education, yes, we need to be looking at implementation, but we also need to be looking at the kinds of models that we've constructed and we're expecting to be implemented. In making some other claims about food education and seeking to transform food education, we do need to shift how we imagine what food education is, because we need to get beyond nutrition as the dominant model, and we need to think more broadly about what food education we need in order to transform those food systems. What's interesting about versions of food education is how the social determinants of health, despite all that we know about the impact of social determinants of health, those determinants tend to be neglected or we suffer from lifestyle drift, where we tend to neglect those social determinants and focus and hone in on individual lifestyles. And I think that that's something that we do really need to remedy. And I think we need to actually start to think about, how do we educate young people about the social determinants of health, and thinking about empowering them to bring about social change in their environments and in their communities. The other thing that becomes obvious is there's a huge gap between some nutrition programs and the educational priorities. And in the Pacific, for example, and as many other countries, the Pacific as a region is undergoing significant educational reform. And so schools and teachers are really busy trying to engage with that reform agenda and change their practices. And so we're seeing the language of youth voice, we're seeing social action, we're seeing the emergence of new assessment regimes, a big focus on numeracy and literacy, and so on. And I think that we need to be thinking about how we can harness those educational priorities and start to embed those priorities within our food education programs. It will help with getting traction in schools, but it also adds to versions of food education that emerge. I can see that I have to wrap up very shortly, but I wanted to just introduce you to one of the kinds of new forms of food education that we've been working with here in Melbourne with Vic Health as a support. So people might know Sandro DeMaio. DeMaio's name, he's the CEO of Vic Health and been very active in the agriculture, nutrition and health world. We've developed a model called Kids Co-Designing Healthy Places. It engages kids in auditing their local food environments and actually working with local councils to recommend changes and coming up with solutions for changes in their local environments. I will finish there, but you can actually look it up online, and it also, just for future reference, it did get acknowledged as a finalist in the Knowledge Action Portal on NCD's Future Generations. So you'll be able to find it online and have a look at it. But what that model does is it puts into action all of the education priorities. It engages with the social determinants of health and gets kids to think about the impact that food environments have on their food choices, but also encourages them to think about how we can take action with local councils to bring about change to local food environments. Thank you for listening.
And thank you very much indeed. So you challenge us in terms of needing to shift our imagination around what food education is and what it contributes, and you give us an intriguing set of examples to the end, which we can all explore in more detail in the question and answer, but also beyond this. So thank you, it is appreciated. So the last of the four speakers, Alejandro Goren, who will speak to us around governing quality and safety in informal dairy markets, using evidence from Kenya, Tanzania, and Assam in India. Alejandro, over to you.
Thank you, Scott. This is work that I've been done in collaboration with a really great team. And I just want to mention the others: Emma Blackmore, Julia Nicolini, and Bill Vorley at IIED, and my colleagues Silvia Alonso, Ram Deka, Charity Quinoa, and Delia Grace from the International Livestock Research Institute. And this is about quality and safety in milk markets, which is, I'll go to my first slide here. First, quickly to give you some context, why informal dairy markets? Well, most countries in the world, or many countries in the world, milk is still distributed like you see in the picture here. It's not packaged, it's not pasteurized, it's not in a supermarket shelf, but actually sold raw or fresh in the street like this. And this is a really crucial source of, well, employment for the people who are doing it, producing it and trading it, but also for low-income people, it's a really critical source of nutrition and affordable nutrition. And for many people who cannot afford other forms of protein, milk is really, really, really central. So the thrust of this project is trying to understand what are some of these concerns around the fact that it's not pasteurized, it's not refrigerated. Is it safe? Is it appropriate? And here the policy and politics aspect is really interesting, because most policy tends to marginalize this informal sector, and sometimes this marginalization is actually more of an aggressive persecution of this sector. So we were trying to understand, how is this informal sector regulated with regard to milk trade? What do people in the informal sector do to ensure and how do they understand quality and safety? And then what openings do we see for interesting and innovative policy approaches? So we did a study in 3 countries, looking at dairy sector and milk markets in Nairobi in Kenya, Arusha in Tanzania, and Guwahati, the capital of Assam in India. And we used really 2 sources of information. We used a survey of market actors, over 400 participants in the survey, really kind of heavily biased towards consumers and traders, and less so wholesalers and producers. And then we complemented that with a number of interviews, deep interviews with some key informants in the sector. So what you'll hear today draws really from both the survey and the informant interviews. So here in your photo is how we, at least, I'm speaking from London, by the way. Just this is how milk looks here, and in a way what we found is that the policy vision for governments in all these countries kind of looks like this. This is what they'd like. They all are aware of informality, they understand its importance, but they would like this. They would like pasteurization, industrialization, a cold supply chain, branded and packaging, because this is associated with safety. And so this is a big vision of the sector. Now, in terms of how the sector is regulated, we saw some interesting differences. So raw milk, which is what is traded, is semi-illegal in Kenya. And by that I mean that it's officially banned in cities, but rural trade is still permitted, but legal in Tanzania and Assam in India. And then Kenya has a whole system of licenses and permits that are required from vendors from different types of authorities. But we found that these requirements are much more light touch in Tanzania and Assam. And again, we found some very similar institutional designs in Kenya and Tanzania. They both have dairy boards, and India has a much more government-oriented directory. The dairy boards tend to be more multi-stakeholders. And then we found that throughout, really the capacities, despite all these institutional arrangements, the capacities for enforcement were weak in general. And this little graph that we have here is a little summary of how we kind of see the regulation and how it's approached in different countries, from an repressive end where the informal market is not considered legal or desirable, to Tanzania, which is a more neutral situation, to Assam, where it's largely tolerated. And then what we found is that almost regardless of the regulatory environment, compliance was quite low. So most of the traders that we talked to did not have licenses, and in India, in fact, they didn't know they existed. Traders thought they were too expensive, or that they were not big enough to need them. And often they didn't have any consequences, except in Kenya, where, as you see here in the photo, milk can get confiscated by the authorities. And unsurprisingly, where enforcement is more repressive, the views of informal actors, of the regulators, is more negative and more neutral when it's a bit more lax. And this is, I think, the central point of this whole talk is, regardless of policy or regulation, everybody cares about quality and safety, and everybody does something to ensure it. So there's no formal testing, there's no lactometers, there's no refrigeration. People rely on smell, really, and appearance. And crucially, they rely on trust, and they rely on repeated interactions with traders. And if sometimes they get a bad batch of milk, they just won't go back to that trader. So this system of repeat interaction and trust and loyalty is really essential. Consumers also, by the way, boil the milk. So even if there might be some hazards, the actual risk at the consumption end is relatively low. And as I say here, these measures appear to work. So we found very few complaints about milk spoilage on the part of the traders, and indeed no reports of being sick on the part of consumers. But people, I mean, it's not all perfect. People do complain that there's adulteration, that they need better skills, facilities, etc. So to wrap up, just to say that informal milk markets are the dominant way in which low-income consumers get milk in many places. So they're really central. The other is that there's like an interesting convergence in the policies and in the outcomes, but interestingly, differences in the approaches. But we found that these approaches don't seem to produce different results. And in terms of the policy here, we found a really bad mismatch between the policies and the regulatory environment and what the actors can do. Pasteurized milk is not going to come anytime soon. This confrontational approach, as in Kenya, for example, is not producing better quality and safety outcomes. And we find that this idea of these relationships of trust and loyalty, that's a real interesting germ on which a much more proactive approach to the sector can be done. Thank you, and also thank you to our funders. and to all the people who helped us make this study possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. So just again, most compelling presentation. The Kenyan restrictiveness and the sort of benign neglect of Assam, which is, I think, stated so powerfully in the abstract in terms of what opportunities exist then in terms of future governance of this particular food system. So thank you for that. So we have around 40 minutes or so for a discussion to get a little bit deeper into some of these issues. It struck me that every presenter did refer to a number of papers, did refer to research. So in other words, there's an opportunity to go much deeper beyond this particular session and to urge everyone to go and have a look at those abstracts once again with a set of references that are connected to each. There's a lot in there that we can take much, much further. So what I'd like to do is just to draw from the comments, the questions that have been posed, and to just flight one for each of the presenters as a start, and then to get the conversation going. And I'll try and engage with as many as possible so that we've got a chance at everyone's sort of questions are heard. So Jody, in terms of your focus on trade, a question from Anna Heffeth in terms of trade can increase access to diverse and healthy foods as well as ultra-processed foods. So both dimensions of food. Was the Nutrition Coalition pro-trade with regards to access to diverse nutritious foods? So a very clear question, but also requiring a little bit of elaboration of the story behind it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to raise a few questions for each, just so that there's a chance for everyone just to think a little bit. You certainly raised a lot of interest in terms of the question of food justice being taken over or appropriated by the imperialistic food security discourse. So placing food justice and food security is sort of almost these two polars, and the one sort of appropriating the other. And could you clarify a little bit more about what you mean by that? So that was something from Sunita. Anna, you had a question in terms of, again from Sunita, in terms of the research challenges in working directly with children. For example, safeguarding procedures, those sorts of things. And also what you mean when children are involved in co-design process. What is the age of these children? Alejandro, for you, I have a question that really struck me in terms of comparing the sort of the strictness, the regulation in Kenya, sort of in-betweenness of Tanzania, and then this benign neglect of Assam. Being able to engage with Kenyan regulators and policymakers, how do you bring in arguments around allowing the consumer, people interacting with those making the milk available, to trust it themselves and to use their own trust and loyalty rather than the reliance on the state? How do you almost square that in terms of a very complex issue with Kenyan regulators that believe what they're doing is for the benefit of the population? So over to the panel. Maybe I can ask Jody to respond first.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to Anna for the question, because it's really key. Trade, and I hope I made it clear, trade is an important part of how we all get our food and our nutrients. Fresh foods are a lot less traded. So something like 7% of vegetables are globally traded, a very small amount, compared to the amount of processed foods. And for obvious reasons, they're less perishable processed foods, easier to trade around. And previous work, not our work, has found correlations and connections between volume of trade in general and sort of the more negative nutrition impacts. But that's not to say that trade itself is wholly negative. In terms of Anna's question, it was really striking in this research that the Nutrition Coalition had very little understanding of trade policy, of trade policy making processes, and really very few ideas on the good, the bad, or the ugly of trade as a thing that affects nutrition. So one of the things that was really clear from this, because also the Trade Coalition, they had a little bit more idea about food and nutrition, but you know, they weren't particularly aware of nutrition transition and of any of this evidence. So kind of educating both sides, I suppose, or making available this information that we do have from different contexts, but also now from Vietnam, especially to the nutrition actors, I think. Making people aware how these trade processes happen and why they matter, enabling them to engage better in these trade policy negotiations. The Ministry of Health was the last to provide any input into the trade policy negotiation process for the CPTPP. They didn't seem to see it as any of their business, and yet quite apart from the types of foods that are traded, we see that it does restrict the space for implementing these broader social welfare policies. So yes, people, if they ever think about it, clear that it's great to trade some foods and probably not others, but the deeper issues in this sort of policy process weren't really considered by the Nutrition Coalition, and we think there's huge scope to bring those issues in.
Thanks, Jody. Busisa?
Yeah, hi. So thanks for that question, non-question. I think you know, it's just, you just chucked it back to me, and it's something very abstract. And look, I think for me, what I would like to say perhaps is to say, look, one of the most influential scholars we have, you know, in the sphere is Amartya Sen, and you know, is the capabilities approach still of relevance today? And the reason why I pose that question is to say, part of what he says there, you know, he speaks to the democracy deficit as contributing, you know, to the issue and the struggle against hunger and food insecurity and so forth. Ultimately, what I'm seeking to drive home here is, what does food democracy look like? You know, if we are talking about an equitable, nourishing food system that caters to all. Part of that is, if we're going to anchor this discussion in a human rights discourse, we need to be clear and we need to get rid of assumptions insofar as, what does the right to food mean for the agriculture sector, for the health sector, for the economic sector, for the trade and industry and so forth. And then in so doing, then we respond to this issue of food and nutrition as a multi-pronged problem. But then moving on from that, right? Part of that conversation, if we are talking about food justice and my concerns about food security not offering any worthwhile solutions in light of the genealogy and it being at the forefront of, you know, unpacking this issue for us. So now, leaning back on this appetite I have for human rights, then the next thing is, what is the role of business and human rights? Because the food system ultimately is beyond the state. You know, it's anchored in a very complex, you know, arrangement. And then part of that then goes back to Ruggie principles to say, what is the role of business as well as people who are meant to carry this burden together with this. Now, from a global political economy of food, what am I saying when I say food justice, food security is not really leading up to much? Because what I see is that even, you know, in terms of current affairs and, you know, current developments, that there's a current co-optation even of the food sovereignty movement. So leading up to the Food System Summit, why are we now, you know, looking to expand those traditional pillars of food security? And we are now talking about agency. We are now talking about sustainability. Where was this conversation located to leading up to this point in time? And what does that mean for the food sovereignty struggle and other establishment sort of narratives moving forward? And more so, what does then this militancy, this food sovereignty rhetoric, this call for food justice then mean for the multiple burden of malnutrition and some of these concerns that squarely then fall on us as public health practitioners? Let me leave it there for now. Sure.
Thanks, Busisa, and thanks also for engaging with another question around the summit. I'm going to push you a little bit on that in a little while. Diana, a question just in terms of the inclusion of children in your research, with a sort of more specific around age. But yeah, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I mean, it's quite interesting when you look at research on children and people involved in childhood studies, you'll see that there's a significant history of the use of participatory methods with children. And so we've targeted that particular project has targeted 8-year-old to 12-year-olds. But we've also provided resources to support this work in early childhood, right through to upper secondary. So it is, you can use it with a range of age groups, but you have to tailor it obviously to each of the age groups' needs. In terms of researching with children, we've done quite a lot of that. So we have quite a lot of experience of actually engaging with kids, with their families, in school settings. And because we're actually working with teachers and trying to connect this initiative with schools and local councils, we think that actually having teachers and also possibly parents in the room, that helps us work with the research relationships and ensuring that the kids have the consent of their parents to participate, and parents are well aware of what they'll be involved in, but kids are also really well aware of what they'll be involved in, and they've given consent as well.
Thanks, Diana. Alejandro, the comparisons between
Yeah, so it's a very good question actually on how the extent to which governments are engaging consumers at all. And I think my general thought is we found very little engagement or understanding of consumers, and I think that's probably everywhere actually. I think food safety is a very top-down thing, and I think this idea of trying to understand perceptions, practices of consumers is not like front of mind, let's say, in policymakers' minds. I think this applied to all the countries, certainly that we studied, but I think it probably also applies to the UK and everywhere else. Now, specifically on Kenya, I think there's an added difficulty, which is there's a very strong bias against the informal sector for a number of reasons, and a number of really vested interests on the part of the government to protect what is actually a fairly strong dairy industry in Kenya. So I think the push of the government has been to just basically expand the size of the pasteurized dairy industry. And I don't think, I think that the excuse or the what they would say is that they're protecting public health and public safety. But in fact, I think there's economic interest on the part of the dairy processors. The president's family himself, he owns a large stake of the big dairy industry in Kenya. So I think there's quite a bit of an ambition to expand that. I think it has been particularly difficult to engage Kenyan policymakers, even though ILRI is based in Kenya and have worked in Kenya for a number of years. It's very, very difficult to engage. And I think this very repressive stance against the informal sector is kind of something that is hard to break into. And we don't see and have not found a lot of possibilities to change minds there. But yeah, sorry, it's kind of like a downer, but that's the reality in Kenya. It's much more openings in the other countries for sure.
Thank you very much. I think that elaborates very nicely. Question, Jody, for yourself, how the low and middle income countries such as Vietnam can overcome technical barriers, since small scale producers still play an important role in the food industry. So that's a question that is now focusing in terms of lessons from Vietnam more generally for low and middle income countries, and indeed the question of overcoming technical barriers in their own context of the role of small scale production. If you'd like to engage that.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. So we were looking more at the trade policy process and how the the process of negotiating that trade deal and then what was written in that trade deal affects the policy space beyond trade for other social welfare policy and outcomes, so nutrition and health. So we weren't looking at kind of volumes of trade or what small holders are doing. I mean, the Vietnamese government does have a program of sort of cooperatives to try and aggregate small farmers, particularly in rice, but also in other things, to try to help them engage more in global trade. But that wasn't really what we were looking at here. It was more, how does the existence of this trade deal, which is legally enforceable, whereas policy isn't, how does that change what the government is able to do in terms of shaping sort of food systems policy and broader nutrition and health policy? So I'm not sure I have many insights on how to overcome these technical barriers to trade, because it wasn't really the focus. But I think acknowledging that these barriers exist is a first step towards thinking through, for the Vietnamese context, what could then be done. But I think our work probably only goes as far as illustrating that these exist and illustrating perhaps why they exist in terms of the process of creating these policies. And then, yeah, it's certainly a next step is thinking through what to do for specific groups such as smallholder farmers.
Thanks, Jodie. And I think where you are reiterating also the idea of a hierarchy of policy, and that there are certain things that supersede others, and to be cognizant and how to work with that. I think that came through so clearly in both the paper and indeed your presentation. So you've engaged a series of questions in the comment, and I would like to draw everyone's attention to the discussions that are in fact unfolding in terms of the text responses. But just to get your perspective a little bit more sort of clearly about this relatively recent shift towards food systems narratives. So that's the question as it's posed, with a second question that sort of reiterates it. How do you feel, or do you feel, that the relatively recent shift to food systems narrative and the deployment of resources to fix these systems in technocratic ways may be superseding this in a similar problematic way? So the way you outlined the whole concept of food security superseding rights, sovereignty, justice. It's again a little bit more philosophical, but I think if you can elaborate it in terms of your own experience, what you've witnessed in terms of the pushback against a lot of the food system narrative leading up to this summit that we are ultimately facing, it would be useful to hear.
Yeah, so I think for me, I just start off from the premise that the food system is not broken. It works as intended by whoever those are behind this veil of secrecy that, you know, we struggle to really unpack and make sense of. So the food system is not broken. It's operating as exactly as intended. And part of that is because what we now see is that there's been talk of a great reset for quite a while right now. And when you look at what that means for food systems, of how it is that we are approaching this window of opportunity and what it could mean for transformation of food systems, is that once again, we are not talking about a food systems approach. Instead, what we're seeing is science. We're talking of fake food even, you know, we're trying to find all these other responses as though we are not in tune with what we've been grappling with leading up to this moment. But also, I guess what I want to say is that for me, ultimately, is that I'm also sympathetic and in tune with the complexity of this issue. Because once again, I go on to say, what is the promise of the right to food? So even if we had to get the relevant characters into the room to sit here and engage us, what relief are we asking for? What are we trying to fix? What are those technocratic approaches which will lead to a nourishing food system for all? Because ultimately it's about how does trade and investment impact food systems? ultimately at the end of the day? I think that is a question we need to grapple with, but also staying cognizant of the fact that food is health. But in the same spirit, health is a continuum. You know, we need to speak about environmental health. We need to speak about a whole range of issues that speak to this, you know, health master frame of ours that we're putting at the forefront of this discussion. So with that said, I think for me, leading up to the Food System Summit, in light of this complexity, in light of the fact that I bring my own biases to the discussion, I think what is key is to be clear on the force field analysis that is informing all of our efforts leading up to the summit. But beyond that, what are the lower hanging fruits? So what is it that we can definitely leverage just off dialogue? Because this is an opportunity for dialogue, if anything else. But once again, I could go on forever, but for me, what is of concern is where is the nutrition discourse located if we are talking about human health, well-being, and attending to the multiple burden of malnutrition. Yeah, something like that.
Thanks, Busisa. And I think reiterating again, this sort of raising the question of the right to nutrition as opposed to the right to food, and what that then provides us with in terms of thinking about, I think, more specific focused solutions. Diana, a question for you in terms of more specifically around how did children perceive or experience their own food environments? Was this part of your research? And if so, did it change with age? So
thank you, and thanks for the question. It certainly is part of our research, and I need to just reiterate that this process is still ongoing. So we're currently working with the councils at the moment to implement the project. On the resource, on the website, you'll actually see a section of resources where we piloted the program and we collected the data that kids had produced. And so you'll see that they've taken photos of vending machines, of facilities, playgrounds, the cost of food, and they've done price comparisons and they've sent those in. So, and they were kids aged from 8 to 12. So before they do the project, we developed an animation that actually serves to try and help them develop the key health literacies they need to understand the food environment and how it impacts on their unhealthy eating. So in some ways, we really tried to support them to begin to understand that, and then to be able to go out and conduct the audits. And in the data that we've collected, you can see that there is a good understanding of some of the aspects of the local food environment and how it impacts on healthy eating. As to whether it changes over age, that's a really interesting question. I think kids' understandings become more sophisticated. But we're yet to find that in the research, and I'm not sure whether we've got the funding to look closely at that, but I'm interested in that question as well.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate that. Alejandro, pushing you a little bit further in terms of what kind of policy tools that the government applied to control the informal milk sector in Kenya. So what kind of tools did they use in terms of regulation? And sort of accompanying that, are there any improvements in food safety control from the government's effort? So did regulation have the impact that it was intended in terms of food safety?
Yeah, before that, can I just quickly respond to something that Busiso said about the food system not being broken? Just very quickly to say, I think generally I would agree, but I think it's also important to be precise about what that means. And I think this informal dairy gives a really nice kind of glimpse into what that might mean. I think informal dairy is providing affordable nutrition to people who would not be otherwise able to afford it. And I think trying to change that is kind of breaking something that isn't broken in a way. And so this kind of narrative crisis around the food system, it is things precisely like this informal dairy that are not being talked about as cases in which it's actually working quite well. So anyway, I just wanted to respond to Busiso, or to just add that as a kind of interesting kind of window into what it might look like of a food system that is working, and where this kind of excessive regulation, or not excessive, but just this more conflictive approaches to regulation might be doing more damage than good. And on the point of Kenya, I'd like to make a distinction between policy and regulation, which I've tried to do before. But I think if you think of policy as the kind of grand vision strategy, actually the policy is all about pasteurization. It's the same across countries. What makes Kenya different is that they have a more draconian approach to regulation. So the kind of how the rubber hits the road in terms of how the policy meets reality, that's where the problem is. And so by doing things like banning raw milk, by basically banning everything except pasteurized milk, those are their regulatory instruments to try to achieve that policy. I think what we found is that they haven't made much difference actually in terms of the health and safety outcomes. And partly because people do not comply, even though they feel that they could be harassed, sometimes they'll be persecuted. The actual practices, the day-to-day practices haven't changed that much. So I'd say it's really questionable the extent to which these policy tools are, or rather regulatory tools are having the desired effect. And in fact, they could have the opposite effect, which is to push this informal dairy further into kind of the realms of illegality, where it can become more and more dangerous, or where some of these quality and safety practices that we documented might be just completely thrown out.
Thank you very much. So unfortunately, I'm watching time and I see we've got no more than 3 minutes left together. So rather than throw out another question, just to try and pull some threads together and then hand back to Hallie to give us an opportunity to reflect more through the poll. We had four wonderful presentations that I think took us through a breadth of issues in terms of some of the big food policy and politics questions. I think some of the real key philosophical debates and tensions were raised throughout, either explicitly or implicitly. Jody, in terms of talking through trade policy and its implications for food and nutritional security policy, and indeed implied this idea of a hierarchy of policies and being cognizant of that, and without taking that sort of broad, strategic, nuanced view of what's happening in that terrain. You know, are we falling short in terms of thinking around public health and nutrition ultimately? I think what was also a little glimpse of innovation in the paper was a methodology that is available to countries to apply, to use, to be able to shed light on these questions and issues. Luciso, I think, laid out very clearly some of these paradigms, as he called them, these frameworks around justice, the legal concept, around the technical sort of overview of food security, but also the politics of sovereignty. And he placed that in a sort of, he argued that without thinking around power and agency and who's controlling those narratives, we see that some of them may in fact become superseded or enveloped by others. And he raised the question towards the end that rather than fall back in terms of some form of solidarity with one or other of these positions, that there are opportunities for dialogue, for bringing these things together. But he also argued about the need for clarity, about what it is that we are seeking when, for example, we talk about the right to nutrition. What is it that technically a policy can be compelled to then frame in order to respond? Diana talked us through, I think, very carefully about the whole question of school food education, this argument that we need to be thinking beyond the implementation of particular education policies to thinking around models, the approaches that lie behind them, and the importance of bringing together different disciplines or disciplinary models in terms of education. And so that we are very clear around how we are aligning it with educational reform. And that really struck me, how we imagine what food education is and breaking away from our perhaps bounded notions of that. So again, I really enjoyed the idea of the politics of education being brought directly into the politics of food. And Alejandro, I think the importance of informal markets coming through very, very strongly, about some of the intended and unintended consequences of regulation in particular, as opposed to policy, but the importance of things such as trust, of loyalty, of solutions such as boiling milk, as finding opportunities for food safety. And I think then being able to find innovation in governance and having that spectrum across from Kenya through to Tanzania and then ultimately to Assam, I think was incredibly useful. So with that, to thank the presenters and to draw everyone's attention back to the abstracts, to really remind everyone to have a look at them again, the references, and then to follow when the full papers become available. And indeed to thank you all for very useful and interesting questions, which I think have really deepened the discussion. Hallie, over to you in terms of just pulling this together at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, and everyone who has participated in this panel and in the meeting. This was a great discussion. I am now going to launch a feedback poll. It would be great if you could please respond to these 3 quick questions. We are always trying to improve our programming, so we'd really appreciate your feedback on those. I'd also like to draw your attention to the main poster presentation session in Spatial Chat. And you can join that in about 20 minutes here with a link that I have just dropped into the chat box. So please do join us for our poster presentations. We're very excited to be using this new Spatial Chat, and we think that you'll find it fun and interesting as well. And then just a quick note that we have a few social hangouts and side events at the end of today's program. We have an Imana Fellowships Q&A. So if you are interested in potentially applying for a fellowship with us, please do find us there. We also have WEA Friends and Family, a conceptual model of the relationship between nutrition and COVID-19 to inform a public health response, and then Health Through Posture, which if you are like me and sit at your desk all day, it might be nice to get a stretch. So I'm going to now drop a link in the chat box for folks to access those side events as well. So please do join us today and throughout the week. So thanks so much to everyone again for joining, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, or evening. Thank you. Okay, it seems like everyone has finished up the poll. So thanks all for joining, and I'm going to now close the meeting. We hope to see you on other sessions soon.